Howdy Doody, folks, and welcome to our America's 250th holiday special. This week I was sitting around and I thought to myself, you know what? I've come across some fun early American weird stories that didn't really fit into my other weird folklore videos. Thus, in celebration of this milestone, I should slap them in a video so folks can enjoy them instead of just letting them fester in my Google Drive. So, really quickly, if you like weird folklore, historical oddities, and everything in between, you should subscribe, like this video, and comment on it to say to YouTube, hey, YouTube, this guy's alright. We're trying to get to 200,000 or so subs this year, and it would help me out a ton. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and let's explore some strange and fun American lore. When most people think of the American Revolution, they think of muskets, cannons, and probably a few guys in wigs signing important documents. But what I doubt they picture is a British warship anchored in the New York harbor running what amounted to a counterfeiting press, which is churning out fake American currency by the boatload. But this is exactly what happened. And this might have come closer to ending the war than many of the Revolutionary War's actual battles did. Let's back up a bit first, though, for context, because to understand why this worked, you have to understand how fragile the American currency was to start off. See, in the summer of 1775, just a few days after they buried the dead from Bunker Hill, the Second Continental Congress authorized the printing of paper money to fund the Revolutionary War effort, a currency that came to be known as the Continental Dollar, or simply Continentals. This money wasn't really backed by anything, to be clear, except for the promise that if the revolution succeeded, this money might one day be worth something. Thus, Congress enlisted engravers and printers to make Continental dollars, including, among a bunch of other folks, a silversmith you might have heard of named Paul Revere. They started by printing a small run of about $6 million, a number that would actually grow to hundreds of millions by the end of the Revolution, a number that actually tanked its value, giving rise to the phrase, not worth a continental. Admittedly, my impression is that Congress didn't really need any help destroying the value of its own currency, but despite this, the British decided they'd also lend a helping hand. See, at some point, someone in high command in the British Army, though it's generally historically unclear whether this was a coordinated decision from London or something that just organically spread among British officers, landed on the idea that it might be smart to flood the enemy's economy with convincing fake bucks, and then sit back and relax as the currency crumbled. This wasn't a new idea, mind you. Prussia had done something similar to Poland during the 7 Years' War a couple of decades earlier, when they counterfeited Polish coins to destabilize the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The British just adapted the same playbook. Thus, New York, which fell under British occupation for most of the war after 1776, became ground zero for this operation. And this operation worked, largely because these new American dollars were basically designed to be copied. These bills were commonly printed cheaply, without hardly any attention to security features like more official currencies and modern currencies. And even though each note did carry a handwritten serial number and signature, those were apparently very easy to forge. British engravers, as you might expect, had access to artists and high-quality paper and ink, which created a strange irony where the counterfeit bills were sometimes better made than the real ones, so they didn't hardly stand out at all. Nothing says functional monetary system quite like the fake money being higher quality than the nice articles. Heck, according to one account from the Journal of the American Revolution, a lot of the counterfeiting operation ran out of print shops in British-held New York, and at least one contemporary rumor, which was never really confirmed, held that a printing press for fake currency operated aboard a British ship anchored in the harbor, possibly the frigate the HMS Phoenix, which allegedly spent a year and a half cranking out huge quantities of the stuff. The Continental Congress hadn't exactly made this hard either. The paper it used for legitimate currency, it was infused with little blue fibers and flecks of mica to make it distinctive, a security measure of sorts, but the material wasn't rare at all, and an organization like the British Empire had no trouble at all sourcing lookalike fibers. In fact, in August of 1779, the American frigate Dean intercepted a British vessel called the Glencairn off the coast, and inside they found a box that its owner tried to throw overboard before capture. Then, when the crew fished it out of the water, they found it held, in the words of the report Commodore Samuel Nicholson sent to Congress, I quote, "materials for counterfeiting our currency, consisting of types, paper with silk, and isinglass in it. In other words, they'd caught a literal counterfeiting starter kit crossing the Atlantic. And you're probably also wondering, how did these fake bills make it into folks' pockets? Well, there were a few methods. Some were subtle, some not so much. One method involved deserters of the Revolutionary Army. British agents would find colonists who'd abandoned the Patriot cause, and they'd hand them pockets full of counterfeited Continentals, and then send them back across lines to spend it. Something that was, admittedly, sort of a dangerous job. For example, a soldier named David Gamble, a man whose surname was apparently less a family name and more a career plan, of the 8th Pennsylvania, deserted, and he got caught with fake bills on him. And then he was subsequently court-martialed and sentenced to death by the order of George Washington himself. Other times, the approach was a bit more bold. Some British-controlled newspapers in New York ran literal advertisements looking for people willing to travel into the rebelling colonies and, I quote, wallpaper the countryside with continental currency. One such ad, printed in the New York Gazette on April 14th of 1777, specifically solicited people to carry any number of counterfeit notes south. Washington actually noticed this ad and sent a copy of it to Congress, writing that the scheme shows that no artifices are left untried by the enemy to injure us. There was also a POW angle to this. Allegedly, after General Burgoyne's army surrendered following the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, the surrender terms were supposed to let the British troops sail home to Europe, but Congress refused to honor that, in part citing evidence that captured British soldiers had been spending counterfeit continental money to buy supplies from locals while in custody. So ultimately, did these British efforts to squash the American currency work? Sort of, though also, thankfully for the Americans, not quite. See, inflation during the Revolutionary War, even without this counterfeiting, was genuinely brutal, and by the end of 1777, the real value of the continental dollar had already fallen to about a fifth of what it started at. By 1781, the exchange rate had crumbled to about $225 in paper currency for every $1 in gold or silver. For instance, Joseph Plum Martin, a Connecticut soldier who kept a memoir of his service, described getting paid $1 worth of value in paper money near the end of the war, and it came out to about 1,200 nominal dollars, which he then went on to spend entirely on a single quart of rum. By 1781, a loyalist newspaper, Rivington's Royal Gazette, gleefully reported that a crowd in Philadelphia had paraded through the streets with paper dollars pinned to their hats like cockades, bringing along a dog whose back was, instead of feathers, plastered in devalued continental bills after it was tarred. Benjamin Franklin, looking back on the whole episode later in life, was also pretty honest about it. Paper money, he wrote, had been a tool with which the colonies fought the war, so the British resolved to deprive us of its use by depreciating it, and the counterfeiters they employed performed so well that huge quantities of fake bills circulated through every state before anyone even caught on. The depreciation, Franklin noted dryly, meant that while the British profited handsomely off the scheme, it didn't actually erase what ordinary Americans owed each other. So people were left broke and still getting hounded for debts they could no longer pay in worthless money. In short, the currency never fully collapsed, and Congress managed to prop the system up just enough with price controls, loans, and the 1778 alliance with France, which restored some confidence that the war might actually be winnable. But the economic damage from the counterfeiting continued beyond the war's end in 1783. Veterans and merchants spent years afterwards buried under debts in a currency that had been quite successfully poisoned, something that fueled future unrest like Shays' Rebellion, and something which, in turn, became one of the main arguments for scrapping the Articles of Confederation altogether and drafting the Constitution. In short, in a sense, paper money in 1777 was arguably a battlefield in its own right, just one fought with ink and micaflex rather than muskets. Quick question for you. When you think of Revolutionary War era technology, do you think of, submarines? If not, you probably should, and I swear I'm not making this up. See, the world's first combat submarine wasn't built by some 20th century navy with steel and diesel, but by a farm boy from Connecticut out of an oak barrel and wrought iron hoops, and it went up against the most powerful navy on Earth in 1776. This is the story of the Turtle. Our inventor here is a man named David Bushnell. born August 30th of 1740 to a farming family in Saybrook, Connecticut. David's early life was pretty unremarkable. He worked the family farm, read a lot in his spare time, and by 26 he was still unmarried and living at home. But then, in the span of about 3 years, he lost both of his parents and 2 sisters. And grief, it turns out, can be a strange catalyst. Bushnell used about half of his inheritance to do something out of character for a farmer of his age. He enrolled in Yale College at 31, and was about a decade older than most of his classmates. And what did he study at Yale? Well, specifically, whether gunpowder could be detonated underwater, something most people at the time just assumed was impossible. Bushnell, though, he tested this, starting with about 2 ounces of submerged powder, and eventually working his way up to reliably igniting 2-pound charges of gunpowder underwater by the time he graduated in July of 1775. This, incidentally, was right around when a certain war was kicking off up in Massachusetts. Bushnell now had a working underwater bomb, but he didn't have a way to reliably sneak it up next to an enemy ship without, getting shot. So he and his brother Ezra set out to work on a delivery vehicle for this charge. And on Poverty Island in the Connecticut River, they would build a roughly 7 by 6 foot, one-man wooden vessel from oak, bound in heavy iron hoops like a barrel, with a bell-shaped hatch on top. Bushnell, in a 1787 letter to Thomas Jefferson, described its shape as resembling 2 upper tortoise shells of equal size, joined together, which is exactly where the name turtle came from. And getting the turtle to actually function was its own little miracle. To submerge, the pilot flooded a ballast chamber with water using a foot-operated valve, and to surface, he pumped that water back out by hand. Propulsion came from a hand-cranked propeller, which was basically borrowed from contemporary spinning wheels, which pushed the craft forward or backward, depending on which way the pilot cranked it. And there was a separate vertical propeller for adjusting depth, as well as a compass and a depth gauge, which was, I kid you not, lit by foxfire, a phosphorescent fungus, since an open flame in an enclosed wooden vessel packed with gunpowder was about as bad as ideas get. A local clockmaker and bell founder named Isaac Doolittle, who also happened to run one of the few gunpowder mills in the colonies, is credited with helping engineering the valves, pumps, and likely the timing mechanism for the explosive itself. And that explosive, mounted on the back of the craft, was a roughly 150-pound keg of gunpowder attached to a wood screw, which the pilot would bore directly into an enemy's hull, detach, and then get the heck out of Dodge before the timer that set the whole thing off went off. And word of this project reached fairly influential folks. For instance, Benjamin Gale, a physician and Yale colleague of Bushnell's, was so impressed that he brought in Benjamin Franklin himself to see a demonstration in October of 1775. Thus, by the summer of 1776, George Washington had personally met with Bushnell to arrange support for the machine, which, by this point, earned itself a military purpose, in Bushnell's own words, for the destruction of vessels of war. The plan, once the British fleet arrived and anchored in New York Harbor that summer, was borderline insane. Admiral Richard Howe's flagship, the HMS Eagle, sat anchored off Governor's Island as part of a fleet carrying, by some estimates, close to 50,000 British troops, Hessian mercenaries, and Marines. Bushnell's plan was to sneak the turtle beneath the Eagle, under cover of darkness, use the screw mounted on top of the vessel to bore into the ship's wooden hull from below, detach the powder keg so it stayed lodged against the hull, and then to pedal away before the clockwork fuse finished counting down. There was just one problem, though. The pilot, Ezra Bushnell, David's brother, had trained for months to operate the turtle and was the obvious choice. But right before the attack, he came down with a fever. Further, David himself lacked the physical strength to operate the machine's demanding hand and foot controls. Thus, given operating the turtle was a massively complicated endeavor, as we described, the Army made the logical choice to assign a volunteer who just learned how to use it. So, with time running out, Bushnell turned to General Samuel Parsons for volunteers, and a Continental Army sergeant named Ezra Lee was picked and given a crash course in submarine piloting. If one Ezra was out of service, I guess another would do. So, on the night of September 6th and into the early morning hours of September 7th of 1776, Lee climbed into the turtle and set off from Manhattan alone towards the British fleet. The plan was pretty simple, provided your definition of simple includes secretly navigating a hand-powered submarine beneath the flagship of the Royal Navy at night. It took him roughly 2 hours of pedaling and hand-cranking in total darkness, just to reach the Eagle. Once he got underneath the hull and tried to bore the screw in to plant the mine, though, the drill simply would not bite. Lee didn't know it at the time, but the ship's hull just happened to have an iron strap or bar running right along the exact spot he was trying to drill into. He tried to reposition to another spot, but by then he'd lost the proper seal, needed to stay submerged and stable beneath the hull, and dawn was closing in. Thus, exhausted, running low on air, and worried he'd been spotted, Lee abandoned the mission, released the mine's timer regardless, and fled the area. About an hour later, the keg detonated in the East River, proving at least that Bushnell's underwater mine mechanism actually worked. The Royal Navy remained intact, but the local fish were presumably left with a few questions. Lee and the Turtle would get one more shot about a month later, this time targeting British frigates anchored near Fort Washington, but that attempt failed too when Lee was spotted by a ship's watch and had to abort before he got close. And then, on October 9th of 1776, the story ended anticlimactically when 3 Royal Navy frigates, the Phoenix, the Roebuck, and the Tartar, forced their way past American defenses near Fort Washington and Fort Lee, and in the process they sank the small American sloop that happened to be transporting the Turtle. Bushnell did claim he later managed to salvage the vessel, but from there its trail essentially went cold. Nobody knows what became of the world's first combat submarine. I should note there's a bit of doubt about how exactly these attacks actually occurred. For example, there's no British record of a submarine encounter or unexplained explosion near the Eagle that first night, which has led at least one modern naval historian, Richard Compton Hall, to argue the whole mission might have been an embellishment or possibly even entirely fabricated as morale-boosting propaganda for the Continental Army. Most of what we know about the mission comes down to just a handful of sources, written well after the fact. Bushnell's 1787 letter to Jefferson, and a separate account Ezra himself wrote decades later, in a letter that wasn't even published until 1893. Bushnell would ultimately go on to build floating mines, including a batch of powder-filled kegs he floated down the Delaware River in December of 1777 in an attempt to strike British ships anchored near Philadelphia, though most of the fleet had already moved by the time the kegs arrived, so the attack mostly just resulted in jumpy British sailors firing muskets and cannons at random floating debris in the river for the better part of the day. This episode is, funny enough, immortalized in a poem by Continental officer Francis Hopkinson titled, fittingly, The Battle of the Kegs. As for Bushnell himself, George Washington seems to have walked away from the whole ordeal impressed, regardless of the mission's failure, later calling Bushnell a man of great mechanical powers, fertile of invention, and a master in execution, which honestly feels like a fair conclusion for a Connecticut farm boy who talked his way into Yale in his 30s, figured out how to explode gunpowder underwater, and then built a one-man wooden submarine to go pick a fight with the Royal Navy, nearly a full century before anyone else on Earth would seriously try something like that again. If you've spent enough time on the internet, you've probably already encountered people who believe George Washington was simultaneously a general, a prophet, and apparently the recipient of an extremely detailed geopolitical briefing from angels per a story called Washington's Vision. This story is usually presented seriously, sometimes even framed as one of the most important or least known moments in American history, recounting that George Washington, alone in his quarters at Valley Forge during the winter of 1777, was visited by a mysterious, glowing female spirit who showed him 3 great perils that would threaten the Republic, with the third, and the worst one, apparently still ahead of us. Cue those ominous chills. It's a fun story, really, but I have to deliver the sad news that it's almost certainly fabricated, not by some enterprising ghost story writer a few decades later trying to cash in on Washington's legacy, but during the Civil War, for a purpose that had nothing to do with the supernatural, and probably everything to do with keeping the Union from losing its nerve. Let's start where the story actually says it comes from, though. This tale is presented as a first-person account from a man named Anthony Sherman, described as a 99-year-old Revolutionary War-era veteran, being interviewed on the 4th of July in 1859 in Philadelphia's Independence Square. Sherman claims that during the darkest days at Valley Forge, He personally witnessed Washington emerge from his quarters, looking shaken, having just spent the afternoon alone. That evening, Sherman says Washington confided in a fellow officer about what had been happening, and what followed is basically a first-person retelling straight from Washington himself. In its vision, Washington described being interrupted while drafting a dispatch by the sudden appearance of I quote, singularly beautiful being, who said nothing, just simply stared at him, until he was overcome by a strange paralysis and a sense of leaving his own body. A voice told him, I quote, "Son of the Republic, look and learn," and Washington was shown a sweeping vision of the future, a cloud of European conflict rolling over America, followed by a scene of the nation split against itself and reconciled by an angel bearing a flag inscribed with the word Union. And finally, a third and much darker cloud, armies from Europe, Asia, and Africa combining to invade and devastate the country, a force that's broken by a blinding light and a host of white spirits who help America fight it off and ultimately emerge victorious. The vision closes with the angel proclaiming that so long as the stars remain and the heavens send down dew, the Union shall last. In short, this was a prophecy. 3 great perils awaited the Republic, and the third, the most terrible one, is still yet to come today. So, if that last part is setting off alarm bells for you, yeah, that's pretty much the whole point of the piece. And in a second, we'll get to exactly why that is. First, though, let's talk about why this story falls apart almost immediately under any historical scrutiny. For one, regarding that Anthony Sherman fella. Well, there was really an Anthony Sherman who served in the Continental Army, but records show he was stationed at Saratoga under Benedict Arnold's command in late 1777, not with Washington's forces at Valley Forge that winter. Per military pension records, he also apparently died in 1840, about 19 years before his 1859 interview about this vision, which admittedly makes giving an interview in 1859 somewhat challenging in my eyes. There's also just no corroborating evidence anywhere in Washington's own papers, letters, diaries, or even in post-war memoirs of any of his officers of anything resembling this event. Washington's life is about as well documented as anyone's, so you'd probably expect he'd have had something to say about world-altering supernatural encounters if he had them. Thus, if this vision isn't real, where did this story come from? And why does it read like it's speaking to a 19th century audience rather than an 18th century one? Well, the answer is it is speaking to a 19th century audience. A Philadelphia journalist named Charles Wesley Alexander, who ran a periodical for Union veterans called The Soldier's Casket, you see, had a bit of a habit of writing patriotic fiction, including vision and dream narratives, which featured famous American figures, writing these under the pen name Wesley Bradshaw. This was no secret. Alexander openly praised Bradshaw's work in his own publications, using the pseudonym as a kind of built-in marketing device. Under the same name, Alexander also wrote a piece called General McClellan's Dream, in which the Union General George McClellan is visited in a dream by the ghost of Washington, who scolds him for falling asleep at his post and reveals secret Confederate battle plans. So, yeah, again, it wasn't very subtle. Washington's vision was first published in April of 1861, right as the Civil War was breaking out following the attack on Fort Sumter. And once you know that date, the entire piece just reads completely differently. None of it is really about 1777 at all. It's a piece of wartime reassurance that masquerades as history, aimed at a northern public that's scared that their nation might be tearing itself apart for good. And Washington, who was already the closest thing America had to a saint, was simply repurposed as a divine guarantor that the Union, despite the darkness, was destined to survive. Further, the whole framing device of an aged and dying veteran passing on one final secret before his death only adds to the weight, giving the piece the feel of a testimony that's too sacred to have been published any earlier, rather than what it actually was, a piece of contemporary Civil War era propaganda that was written and published as the war was just getting started. Propaganda or not, though, it worked just as intended, and some prominent Americans even played along. For instance, Edward Everett, the statesman best remembered today for giving the 2-hour-long speech that preceded Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, reportedly praised this piece as teaching, I quote, a highly important lesson to every true lover of his country. Anyhow, Washington's vision got copied and reprinted for decades, even resurfacing in the National Tribune, a newspaper for Union veterans, in December of 1880, 20 years after its publication. And it surged again post 9/11, when its central theme, the idea that America could never be destroyed by an outside enemy, once again vibed with a public that was looking for reassurance. Thank you so much for joining me today on this fun little trek through early America. Admittedly, this was a bit of a lost episode. It was sort of cobbled together from some scripts that I'd written back in the day that didn't quite fit in with the videos they were originally intended to be a part of. Thus, I thought I'd share them with you all here. Now, first off, if you're watching on the 4th of July, I really hope you're enjoying your day and getting some well-deserved time off. Otherwise, I still hope you're doing great. Further, if you enjoyed this video, it would be super great for me if you liked it, commented, and hey, maybe subscribed if you want to see more like this. Anyhow, with that, whether you just saw a wooden barrel pedaling along under the Hudson on your most recent visit to New York, or if your buddy just had a bright idea to devalue the US dollar by flooding the market and you really need to get to him before he gets a felony, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.